I talk about this event called Event 201, which was a pandemic simulation that took place in October 2019 in New York. And it was sponsored by Bill Gates, I think the World Economic Forum, by the Chinese CDC. George Gao was there. Mm-hmm. The social media companies were there. The pharmaceutical companies were there. The big corporate PR firms were there. And they were...
The current DNI was there.
Yeah, the current DNI, Avril Haines, who's the director of national intelligence, who's the top spy now in the world. And at that time, she was the former deputy director of the CIA. And Avril Haines made her bones at the CIA by covering up the Abu Ghraib and the Guantanamo Bay torture tapes, and covering up the illegal destruction of those tapes, and then covering up the illegal tapping of the United States Senate by the people who had destroyed those tapes, or who were trying to protect the people who destroyed those tapes. So she's like a impresario at cover-ups. She's President Biden's top spy. She was the former deputy director of the CIA, and she is at this simulation. What is the CIA doing in a pandemic simulation? They're not a public health agency. As I said, they're an agency that does coups d'etats. And if you look at what they did, that agency is simulating a global coronavirus pandemic that kills 60 million people, which is a lot more than the actual one did, which was 2 months later, which we learned about 2 months later. Although it was already circulating in October of 2019, we didn't know about it until January 2020. So what are they talking about? They're not talking about public health. They're not talking about how do we get vitamin D to everybody to build their immune systems? How do we keep them outside and healthy? How do we get people to lose weight? How do we quarantine the sick and yet, protect constitutional rights and protect the vulnerable and all of those kind of things that you would normally talk about? No. What they're talking about is using this pandemic as a pretext for clamping down totalitarian controls. And the first thing they said is we gotta limit free speech. We can't allow people to criticize government policies. And particularly, we cannot allow people to talk about a lab leak. They're doing this in October of 2019, before anybody of us have ever heard of Wuhan. So, and if you look at it, during that part of the discussion, which is the fourth part, Avril Haines is kind of leading it.
How can governments, international businesses, international organizations ensure that reliable information is getting to the public and prevent highly damaging and false information to the extent that's possible about the pandemic from spreading and causing deepening crisis around the world?
Every time there is something that comes out that is in fact false information that is starting to actually hamper our ability to address the pandemic, then we need to be able to respond quickly to it. One of the things we want to do is work with telecommunication companies to actually ensure that everybody has access to the kind of communications that we're interested in providing, because that's going to be critical for dealing with, obviously, the explosion of the disease.
There's misinformation, and there's some belief. People believe, this is a man-made, some pharmaceutical company made the virus. So we really need to train the health workers, especially health care workers, their access to the patients, to the public. So make sure they got the right information.
And so I think we really need to make sure, one, from a news perspective, that information is being disseminated correctly, and that we have the right resources out there to provide this information.
It's not just about handing people a piece of knowledge. It's also about how we incentivize them to manage their behaviours, which in any communicable disease outbreak, behaviour of one sort will minimise your chance of getting a disease versus behaviour of another sort, which may maximise that chance.
This is a step up from the part of the governments on enforcement actions against fake news.